So thanks very much to Joe, Ezra, and Paco for organizing the conference, including this paper. And it's great to be able to present it. It's a new paper and in a quite different literature to what I usually work in. And so it's great. I really look forward to hearing your comments. It's joint work with Keelan Beirne, who is in the chat window answering comments, and who used to be at Trinity, where we sort of discovered our joint passion for understanding the construction sector and its wider impact on development. Now, the motivation for this paper is embedded in this recent literature that highlights the importance of key sectors that can cause bottlenecks. And what we're really interested here in is the role of intermediate goods in the construction sector. So sort of taking a step back from a national accounts perspective, investment is split up in equipment and machinery and construction. And we're really interested in the second part here, the second component of investment. And that accounts for a sizable share. So typically that share is about 50% of investment. And I'll show you some of the more recent data on that split. Now, in the paper, we'll be paying particular attention to one of the key intermediate inputs in construction, which is cement. And I just want to motivate that, that choice before we go into more details in the paper. So cement is a core ingredient of concrete. It has few substitutes. It's used abundantly. So concrete is the second most used resource in the world next to water. It's a homogeneous good, so differences in quality are less likely to be of importance here, and it's largely non-traded. And so here this shows you the picture. Here this is this gray and white powder. Once you add water, sand, gravel, so aggregates, and some admixtures, you get concrete, and this is ready-mix concrete. So we're looking at concrete prices, but the paper's focus is really on cement here. It's an industry that's also characterized by significant market power, and that's true around the world. And there's also anecdotal evidence where we know that some of the development world's greatest fortunes appear to be based on profits from that industry. So for example, Africa's richest man owns a cement company. Now, what do we do in this paper? Three main things. So first, we start by using confidential microdata on intermediate input prices. And we collect and hand-coded current and historical data on market structure in the cement industry to start documenting three key motivating facts. And we do this at a global level. The first is we look at price dispersion of, and I'll discuss it in much more detail, precisely defined key construction sector intermediate inputs. We'll then, and that will motivate our focus on cement, look at market power in the cement industry. And third, I'll show you some data on the role of construction in capital formation and the role of cement in construction sector expenditures. So probably many of you are thinking now, how can cement really matter? And we'll show you that it matters. The price of cement doesn't matter for many countries, but for some, it matters importantly in their construction sector expenditure shares. The second part of the paper uses an oligopoly model to examine the role of market power in cement, as we think of this as a particular type of distortion in the sector producing investment. And we're going to estimate then the model using data on the global distribution of cement firms. And in the third part of the paper, we just build a simple model of capital accumulation to look at the effects of changes in market structure and markups on the steady state capital stock to get a sense of what is the mechanism through which markups affect the capital stock, and do these effects matter? So what we're going to find is large dispersion of these key construction sector intermediate inputs, and this particularly large difference in the price of cement. There's also a strong bivariate relationship between market power and prices. And we see that cement plays a significant role in construction sector expenditures for some of the countries. Now, in the empirical model of our oligopoly, we see that market power of the cement industry leads to significantly higher prices. So this seems to be an important channel that drives prices. And I'm going to present you our instrumental variables strategy. It would be great to hear whether you think that's a convincing way of doing this. And the quantification exercise illustrates that the steady state capital stock in the poorest countries is most sensitive to changes in markups in cement. So it's really those with the lowest level of capital that have the highest expenditure shares, they have the market structure that's least competitive, and so they're most sensitive to changes in markups. So they're hit by these distortions in a disproportionate manner. Now, why is the construction sector important? If I was presenting this to you in a room, I would be probably pointing at some walls or roofs or floors, but we need physical structures as a requirement, as an input into almost any activity. So if we think about buildings that we need for firms, individuals, or government, we need core infrastructure, roads, bridges, harbors, to transport both goods and people, and it's needed for power generation. So there's this literature on the cost of physical investment being high in low-income countries. And a lot of that literature has typically focused on equipment and machinery, that component of investment, which can be imported, and that could lead to additional frictions, and that those have been studied. Importing goods is less possible for construction sector goods. So there's this direct link between the domestic industry structure and construction, distortions there, and investment prices. Now, the literatures that I think we speak mostly to is this literature on the cost of capital, a literature that looks at input-output linkages in production networks, the role of firm-level markups in general equilibrium, and we'll use our oligopoly model to then apply this in a general equilibrium setting, and then misallocation in developing countries. So I think while our empirical model differs in one or another aspect, I think the main contribution we make to this literature is that we use these new microdata, key intermediate inputs in construction to understand a specific distortion in a sector that's key for investment. So I think here, that's really this use of microdata that we contribute. Of course, there's also literature on cement and ready-mix concrete that's predominantly using US data. Our paper is different in a number of ways. Mainly, we study the industry at a global level. We also have a very different focus. We focus on the macroeconomic consequences of these markups, and that allows us to look at implications for countries at different income levels. And so our price data is much less detailed than what some of these papers have that have market level prices or firm level prices over time. So what we sort of lose in specificity here, we try to look at a broader coverage of countries. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk. I'll start by presenting the key motivating facts that underpin our thinking on this paper. Then I'll talk about the role of market power, and then in the end, the general equilibrium model. Okay, so the data on prices. Our main price data comes from the ICP 2011 and the 2017 version that was just released a couple of months ago. And in 2011, the ICP had a major overhaul of their construction sector PPP. So for anybody who is slightly pedantic about measurement, that change was is really great. So what they did specifically is they dropped an output-based approach, where you had a typical kind of construction project that was then being estimated in its cost, which is rather difficult to do across space with different building standards. It's very expensive, and it makes it hard to compare. So it used to be a comparison-resistant category within the ICP. And they moved to this input-based approach, where they said, let's look at core inputs that we need in the construction sector globally. And so from that core intermediate inputs list, we selected a subset based on two requirements. One was that it's a core input in the construction sector globally. So we looked at the ones that are really essential inputs. And the second requirement was that the ICP data has wide coverage across countries of the input. So what we look at in our core set is concrete and its constituents, so cement, sand, and aggregates. And then we look at bricks, wood, steel, two types of steel. So a key for this paper is that the ICP specified the buyer, the quantity, and the quality. It doesn't rule out heterogeneity in quality, but it's really crucially important in this context. So for example, concrete was specified as ready-mix concrete mixed at a specific proportion and a characteristic compressive strength. Here, this is 20 Newton per square micromillimeter. And so this is a typical type of concrete you would use for a basement. It's a very standard type of concrete. Cement is Portland cement, the most typically used cement. The big caveat we have here is that we have one price per country. So we're not able, and particularly compared to the papers that you look at spatial price differentiation within countries, we have to treat the country as a market in our paper. But we have coverage at a global level. So I'll start by showing you the price differences in the 2011 prices. I'm happy to talk about the later years. I'll just focus, and they're in the paper, I'll just focus on those prices for the sake of time here. So what do these differences look like? So here you can see concrete and then cement aggregate and sand, and the average prices across these regions. And so when you look at the price of concrete, this is a cubic meter of concrete, you can see that there are large differences in these unit prices. So Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is $201 or $202 per cubic meter compared to 100 in South Asia, for example, so, or 83 in East Asia and the Pacific. So these are large, the order of magnitude in these price differences is large. And when you look at cement, aggregates, and sand, you can see here that's really the price difference in cement that's driving this price difference in the price of concrete. So cement here in Sub-Saharan Africa costs $258 per cubic meter. If we compare this with North America, it's $189, and the price differences are even larger when we look at East Asia, the Pacific, or South Asia. Aggregate prices are somewhat high in Sub-Saharan Africa compared to East Asia and the Pacific, quite a bit in South Asia, but somewhat lower than, for example, North America. And then sand prices are fairly similar in Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia. Here North America is somewhat of an outlier. Now, the second set of prices that we have in the paper are softwood prices, bricks, and then these two types of steel, so mild steel reinforcement bars and then structural steel beams. In the softwood prices, you don't see this pattern of higher prices in Sub-Saharan Africa. If anything, South Asia has high prices, but East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have quite prices that are quite in line. The patterns are not repeated as well when we look at bricks. The only other good is mild steel beams, and here Sub-Saharan Africa has higher prices, in line with Latin America and the Caribbean. When we look at structural steel, these prices are fairly similar, low in the Middle East and North Africa, and in North America, but in the rest of the regions, they're fairly similar. So overall, we see large heterogeneity in these key input prices. And so far these prices, the data that I showed you uses exchange rates. So this is even larger when we use the PPP. Relative price ratios are often a factor of 3. The aggregate, and that's sort of a side note that we just want to mention in the paper, is that the aggregate construction sector PPP entirely masks these differences. So even if we look at sectoral PPPs, we wouldn't pick up these differences. What we see is that there are particularly high cement prices in Africa. In 2017, these price differences are somewhat lower, but they're still there. And in light of the cement's importance globally, we focus on cement in the rest of the paper. Not saying that not some of the other price differences are important to be explored, but there's only so much we can do in one paper. So let's look at some more detail. Which are these countries with high costs? So these are the 10 most expensive countries in the world in 2011 in cement prices compared to the United States. So 9 of these 10 countries are in Africa, and these gaps are really large. So Central African Republic, a ton of cement costs almost $500 compared to $140 in the United States. So probably when we go through these countries, we can all come up with different reasons why prices might be higher there. So what we think are sort of the main reasons here, or possible explanations for these high prices, is on the ones at lack of competition, and it's indeed been identified as one of the sectors that would benefit from higher competition in this report by the World Bank. Another theory could be that high input costs drive these high prices. This is not completely in line with the high profit margins that we observe for these cement companies, but it's something that we'll take seriously in the estimation. It could be low demand, so that if there are economies of scale and demand is low, prices are just going to be high. We'll take that into account as well. And other frictions could be also the rule of law, corruption, and political instability. So these are all theories that we're trying to control for in the empirical section. What we're starting with now, taking very seriously, is the role of market structure. So what we do here is we collected these data on the global distribution of cement plants and ownerships of groups, and we equalized those with firms, the way we're thinking about them in about 180 countries at 2 points in time. So we use this global cement report, which contains for each country a chapter on production, consumption, and market structure. And from that, we extracted the number of firms and groups per country. So we use here the group name if it's provided, and otherwise the company name. And so this means, for example, if there's a plant that's owned by Lafarge Holcim, this would be the firm name that we're giving. Even if there's a subsidiary in a country that is then in turn owned by Lafarge Holcim, that would be the firm, because we think that's where strategic decisions are being taken. It's this level of the group, rather than a group owned by a firm owned, or a company owned by a group. Now, we have 2 main measures of competition. One is the number of firms, and the second one is this Herfindahl-Hirschman index, where we use the capacity of firms, which we also have at the level of the country. For each of the firms operating in these countries, we know their capacity. Now, overall, this industry, as highlighted, is before, is characterized by high market power. So 40% of countries have a firm that provides more than 50% of the country's total cement capacity. And so this is an example for Mexico. There are 3 of the 6 groups that are operating there. This is Lafarge Holcim. It's the second largest group in the world, Cemex, and then there's a third company, and these account for more than 3/4 of Mexico's cement capacity in 2011, and it's even more in the recent round of the data. Now, going back to our 10 most expensive countries in 2011, 7 of those had 1 cement firm, 2 had no firms, and 1 country had 3 firms. So it seems like there might be a relationship. So when we look systematically at the data, the graph on the left shows you the deciles of the number of firms. So we bin firms into deciles, and then we look at average prices depending on which decile a country falls into. And you can see this negative relationship. So prices are higher in the lower deciles, so where there's a lower number of firms. And on the right graph here, this is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index in 2011. So the price is increasing in the market concentration of the industry. And these look very similar in 2017. So not much has shifted in that sense. Okay, so the third motivating fact that I want to talk about is talking about cement consumption. So here we use data from both the ICP and on cement consumption. So on the left, this shows you construction share in investment, and this is the figure that I gave you before, is roughly 50%. And we can see that that's the case in both years. So construction is an important part of investment. And then cement accounts on the figure on the right, you can see cement expenditure as a share of construction expenditures. So here we use data on the consumption of cement for each of the countries. And we look at the fraction that takes as a share of construction expenditures. And you can see this is a skewed distribution. It accounts for a very small proportion of expenditures for most countries. The median is 0.08, but the 75th percentile of countries has more than 17%. So as we'd expect, it's used abundantly because it's an extremely cheap good that you can mold into everything. And it doesn't matter for many countries, but there are some countries for whom these high prices translate into very high construction cement expenditure shares when we think about expenditures on construction. Okay, so which are the countries? So this is just to characterize a little bit which countries we're talking about here. So on the left, you can see cement share in construction sector expenditures and log of GDP per capita. And we've highlighted here African countries in red and the rest of the world in black. And you can see these high shares are particularly in the poorest countries. So these are the countries that face the highest prices and they have high expenditure shares. Now the graph on the right shows you cement shares of construction expenditures against cement prices. And this is also giving you a flavor of the non-substitutability of the input. So countries can't just easily substitute away from cement so that the high prices would just decrease their consumption of cement. Okay, so what we see is there's a large price dispersion. Cement prices are about 35% higher in sub-Saharan Africa than in North America, and market power is positively correlated with prices. Cement share of in construction is non-negligible for a specific number of countries and the highest in the poorest countries. Okay, so let's look at the industry in more detail. So what we do in the paper is we write down a simple static model of oligopoly in the production of cement. And then we think about the strategic production decisions, and we allow for free entry with an exogenous entry costs. So that's similar to a model by Beckers and Francois and Melis with a finite number of firms. So the model has sort of two uses. We use it to examine the role of market structure in generating cross-country price dispersion, or three. So it gives us our estimating equation. It then also disciplines our instrument, and we use it to sign the bias in the OLS, which is going to be biased. The main assumptions underpinning it is that firms compete in Cournot competition, which is fairly standard. We assume constant marginal costs, so firms differ in their productivity, but they have constant marginal costs. There are no dynamics here, so it's all static. And we don't model spatial price differences because we get a market level equation, and the market in our case is the country. We don't have price data anyways that are that have within country dispersion. So there's no point here in specifying, making the model more complicated than what we can use it for. So cement firms maximize profits in Cournot competition. So this is very standard. And they have these constant marginal costs, CI, and they take into account their own quantity and the quantity produced by all other firms. And we then, we maximize profits and then sum across all firms, we can express prices as this constant constant fraction of marginal costs. So it's a constant markup. So this is the markup here over marginal costs. Now, I just want to take a moment here to highlight the nonlinearity of these. So we're going to express this markup over marginal, here it's average costs. as this is our markup. And another way we can think about it, and this links then back or forward to our general equilibrium model, is this to think about this as the distortion, the 1 over n times epsilon. And the distortion is actually larger. We show this for different elasticities of substitution. So it's larger the lower the elasticity. And we can see that the impact of an entry of an additional firm is larger the lower the number of firms. And that this is partially why we get the differential effects later on. But I wanted to just flag it right here. Now, when we take logs, we get this relationship between log prices, the log of markup, or this markup function, and average prices. We assume that firms have identical production technologies, and they have this Higgs neutral productivity AI, where the ZI is idiosyncratic productivity. And what we do to get an estimable equation is that we take a first order approximation of this equation 4 here around the benchmark number of firms and input prices. And so we have here this eta j, that's the unobserved component of average productivity. And then we have the epsilon j, that's the mean zero error term. And this is something we can then actually take to the data. Now, this is just sketching how we think about entry. So we define n star as the number of firms in the market such that in expectation their profits are equal to the discounted value of the entry cost. So F is this entry cost that firms need to pay. There are NE firms that enter the market, and this NE is defined as the maximum number of firms, the maximum integer here, so that they're still making, the last firm still makes a positive profit. And they learn their idiosyncratic cost level after they entry and produce if their costs are below prices. And so we can define the number of firms then as the sum of xi's, where that's a random variable, equal to 1 if a firm produces and 0 otherwise, summing from I is equal to 1 to NE. And so this pins down our free entry, the way we specify free entry. Now, the way we use the model is to sign the bias in our main estimating equation. And in the paper, we have a proof that shows that if we assume xi being observed with certainty, the OLS estimators of this parameter delta here are going to be biased towards 0. And the simple intuition of this is that if prices are higher, this incentivizes entry. And so there's the relationship between the number of firms and prices is going to be biased towards 0 because of this incentivized entry. The model also motivates our IV strategy. So what we need is an instrument that proxies for entry costs F, but that's not correlated with average productivity, average unobserved productivity in a country. And so what we're going to use, I'll show you on this next slide, is costs to obtain a construction permit, that's here, and the costs of starting a business from the doing business indicator. So these are really proxies for entry costs of firms. In all of the models, we're going to include our baseline cost controls for scale, so the log of GDP. We're going to include a log of area, that's a proxy for transport costs, and the log of population, that's a proxy for scale. A further concern in the estimation of positive cost shocks affecting all firms. And so here we control for the rule of law, corruption, and instability, political instability. These are data from the world governance indicators. And then as good as we can, we control for cost of input. So fuel and electricity we use from the ICP data. So here we have good measures. Coal is another input cost that's mattering, that's an important one. So here we use import prices using UN Comtrade data, and machinery, we try our best. So here we use the trade data where we get a quantity in terms of kilograms of machinery that these countries import. So we take 4-year averages before our data point in the industry-specific machinery that's for the mineral sector. So this is supposed to proxy for an average price of equipment or import price of equipment. Most of these countries will be importing these machineries, or many of those. Be great to hear whether this is a convincing way of doing this, or there's a better way. But we're trying as hard as we can to control for any of the other explanations that we can think of that might be driving that relationship between the number of firms and prices. We estimate pooled OLS regressions and then IV specifications. So this is, I'll show you the base results here. This is the OLS with the log number of firms and dependent variable being the log price of cement. And in these columns, we increasingly add controls. We always include time fixed effects. We always include scale controls. In the second column, we add our governance indicators. And in the third, we control for the cost of fuel. And this is the IV here. So we see that the effect becomes stronger. So the percentage increase in the price or decrease in the price when we add 1%, when the number of firms increases by 1%, is higher in the IV, which is in line with what the model predicts in terms of the OLS being upward biased. Our F stat for instrument is around 10, which I think, given the type of data that we have here in this aggregated nature, this is almost what we can kind of hope for. The results are quite stable when we add these different types of controls. Okay, great. So here we do a number of robustness tests. So we first use the number of firms per 10 million people, just as a different way of specifying our market structure variable. We use directly the Herfindahl-Hirschman index to look at whether capacity concentration, here industry concentration, affects the price of cement. In the third column, we include this more extensive input lists, input price list. You can see that our observations drop by a lot because these data become the set of countries for which we have all these different bits of data and become smaller. Now in the fourth one, we control for importers. So I was saying that cement is largely non-tradable, and it's actually only 5% of global consumption that is being traded. That doesn't mean that it's not important as an import good for certain countries. So there are some countries that import a large fraction of their cement. Some import clinker and then grind that to their own cement, where we still think that we have cement and clinker firms in the data. So we still think that local market structure is the important one, but for countries importing cement directly, there might be these trade barriers affecting, or trade or frictions in trade that might be affecting the cost. So we control for that, as well as limestone availability. So that's one of the key inputs, or the key input you need apart from heat to produce cement. And then in the fifth column, what we do is it's sort of a trade weighted measure of market structure. The way we're thinking about this is that if you import your cement, it might matter where you import it from in terms of the price that you have to pay for it. So what we do is we look for each of the countries, where's the main trading partner in cement, and then we attribute the fraction of, in proportion to the import fraction, we attribute the market structure of the importer. It also seems to correlate with the price of cement. In that prices are higher, the lower the number of firms. Okay, so what we see here is that market power leads to a higher price. The OLS is biased towards zero, which we were expecting already from the theory. This is robust to different measures of competition, functional forms, and an extensive set of controls. So input prices, importing of raw materials, market structure of the trading partners. We're really trying hard to see here that we control for as much as we can. So the open question here is, what is the wider effect on capital? So I just want to, in the remaining time, sketch what we the way we think about quantifying the general equilibrium implications. So to quantify our results, we plug our market structure into neoclassical models where there are n sectors. What is distinct about what we do in our model is that we model investment and consumption as distinct final goods, which we think for the construction sector that probably makes a lot of sense. Cement is used only in the construction sector, so it's part, which is part of investment. So this is how we think about the linkages. And it combines this all two sector idea with this macro misallocation literature. And the aim of the model is really to quantify the sensitivity of the steady state capital stock to changes in markups in cement, and to see this link between a sector that might be, or that we might think is actually not important to the capital stock. So firms I use capital K, labor L, and they use intermediates. And investment production follows this we don't specify the production function here, but investment uses these inputs, capital and labor. This yields this Euler equation here that's very standard. And we look at the steady state where d log Rk is equal to d log P. So we're always interested here in the steady state. So you can think of our results, it's really this long run impacts. What we do in the paper is we then approximate the impact on capital with this following equation here, where this first part is the direct effect of a change in markup. So we're interested in what a change in markups does to the change in capital, steady state capital stock. So here, this is the change in markup multiplied by cement's weight investment. So this is the Domer weight investment. And so this is the first order direct effect. Here's just the capital multiplier. And then here we have the second order effect. So we approximate this to the second order. And the second order effect has here, this is how the change in cement share in investment changes with markups. Now we quantify this impact using ICP expenditure shares and our data on consumption of cement. So this lambda IC varies for each country. For alpha I, we take a standard value. We have taken different values as well. Our results are as expectedly, it just bumps them up or down. And then for the elasticity, we use estimates from Ryan that looks at the cement sector. So what we do are two experiments. One is a 10% decrease in markups, and then we look at an entry of a single firm. And okay, just so 5 minutes. So here, this table shows you these two experiments. So the first table shows a percentage change in the steady state capital stock from an entry of one firm, and the second one a 10% decrease in markups. Now, I'm showing you these for countries that have more than one cement firm. If we have time, I'm happy to show you the ones for all of the countries. Part of the reason for this is that some of the effects are very large, and we think maybe not very reasonably so large for the countries that have only one firm. And our model is really about an oligopoly, but the gist is very similar. What you can see here, so this is for 3 different elasticities, and these are the average effects. So the average effects are small, as we would expect. An entry of an additional firm has very little effect on the steady state capital stock. Yet you can see that some countries, these effects are non-negligible here. And you can see this as well for a 10% decrease in markups. So the average effects are very small. And on the one hand, this is a large decrease. On the other hand, when you've seen the price differences, this is also not completely unreasonable to look at as a counterfactual experiment. And for some countries, these effects are large. So let's look again at which are the countries where we see these large effects. And you can see these are the African countries that were kind of sticking out before as well. So these are the countries with the lowest levels of GDP. These are the ones with the most, the market structure that's most concentrated, and the highest expenditure share. So these are countries that have sizable effects for in terms of a response to an entry, and we can see this similarly for a decrease in markups. We've changed the elasticities here. Clearly, the lower the elasticity of substitution, the stronger these effects are going to be. So let me wrap up. So what we see here is large price dispersion at a global level of key intermediate inputs, and this is masked in aggregate price indices. We used a simple oligopoly model to quantify the effect of markups on prices. And we can see that the long-run capital stock in the poorest countries is disproportionately sensitive to bottlenecks in essential sectors. These effects would probably be large if we think that, for example, human capital needs physical capital. So from that, we've completely abstracted so far. What we're planning to do next is finalize the quantification exercises that we do in the paper. It'd be great to hear whether you think there are others that we should do. And then we've also matched data, firm level data from world scope with our market structure data. So I think one key piece that's missing here are being able to say something about profits. Thanks very much for taking the time to listen to this, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Martina. We'll open up to questions now.
Hi. So I was made co-host, so I couldn't raise my hand. Sorry.
Everybody should make co-host for the breakout room, just to
I see. Yeah.
that we're gonna explain that in 15 minutes.
Yeah. So first, like, completely fascinating. I really loved it and so interesting. I just have a few questions. First, when it comes to the price measurement, you mentioned sort of different things that could cause these prices. I missed productivity on that list, which I think could be quite important, because I guess that's sort of a general point that when you have a non-traded good, the dollar price, there's no expectation that the dollar price should be the same in all countries. And actually you would sort of need a big analysis of like all the labor input and all these sort of things going into production to sort of say what the prices should be in different countries. And I guess that also goes to the point of like, you know, what are the actual costs and what are the margins in these firms that you were discussing in the beginning. So that was one thing. And I think that once you take that approach, maybe it's true that lots of investment goods are super expensive in poor countries once you sort of measure it appropriately, or they have very, very big markups. It's just that it's hidden by having very low labor costs in the production of them. So that was the one thing. And then the second thing was like on the evidence. So given that the sort of strongest evidence you put forth, I think it was almost, apart from the scatter plot, that, you know, some of Africa's richest men were in this industry. Because I think that actually that thing to me is like a better proxy for the entry cost than maybe some sort of average measures in these countries of like how long it takes to get a construction permit and so on. Because if this is like 50% of the investment in the country and one firm runs 50%, then one firm runs 25% of the investment in the country, it's probably going to be easier to actually just interview some people in these countries and sort of substantiate that this is a closed industry. I did some field study in Ethiopia. It was quite clear that, you know, there were some conglomerates that were very favoritized. So I think that, you know, maybe complement with some qualitative evidence here would give a very, very strong evidence, probably stronger than you can give by throwing in more controls, because I think that, you know, most of us here probably buy that this story sounds quite reasonable. Yeah, so that was sort of those two things I was thinking about.
Okay, great. So on the productivity, it's definitely an important point. It doesn't quite align with the high profit margins that we see if these firms weren't. So I think that's why going to the world scope data and linking these firms' profit margins with the market structure would be kind of a closing that link. On anecdotal evidence, I've actually spoken a lot with people working in the industry. I get newsletters on how to optimize my kiln due to being part of these webinars. And so it is a narrative that they would be not impressed with at all, because they would be saying, yes, of course, that's what happens. Yeah. And I think it's globally. So I take your point that I mean, when you talk to people, even in places like Ireland, it's sort of understood that that is a closed industry. You don't just go and start a cement plant. But being able to say that in some more anecdotal evidence in a systematic manner, I think would be helpful. Yeah.
Hi, Martina.
Yeah.
What do we know about the minimum efficient scale in this industry? I guess I was wondering if that plays a role, because I also thought, you know, you think about the role that cement plays in investment and capital formation, but not really the capital formation of the firms themselves. And if these guys are financially constrained, it could be that this is actually something that either helps them to pay fixed costs, of course, or just helps them to operate at the more efficient scale and accumulate capital more quickly. What do we know about the minimum efficient scale in this industry?
So I need to look into this. I know that there's been, in certain places, there's been a lot of entry and there's overcapacity, but I don't know at a plant level. So if we take a small African country, what would be the optimal number of plants that could be supported given production technology? So that's something I need to think more. That's a good point, yeah.
I guess then the question would also be not only at the plant level, but at the firm level, if there's returns to scale. I was thinking about like oh boy, I'm so bad with names. It's the IO guy at Chicago that did the concrete.
Chad Anderson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the whole point there was like it's not only non-tradable across countries, but it's even locally. It has to be produced locally. So you could imagine that there's many plants, but that there's some returns to scale at the firm level.
That's already made, no?
So most of the papers that look at local production.
No, that's already made. I was just curious about the cement.
Yeah. I mean, cement, to some extent, that's true too, because it's it's extremely expensive to transport. So I think in the US, most of the cement doesn't transport more than 200 miles. And the second part is it's because it binds when it gets in touch with water. It's not great with humidity, so that makes it also fairly tricky to store and then transport over long distances. The problem we really facing here is it's something we would love to look in more detail in. It's just this one price per country that really constrains what we can do in this paper in terms of looking at markets. We have plant level data. For the later period, we know where all of these plants are, and we have looked at kind of concentration of these, but we don't know anything more about them.
It's a great paper.
But have you thought about doing creating data for a country, getting more detail for a particular country? Would that be something that will be particularly informative for your exercise?
So what would you like to see for?
No, just curious. What is something that you're thinking about?
Oh,
it's something
yeah.
you were to have this whole distribution of prices in X number of African countries.
Can I add something on that, Martina?
Yeah.
First,
Yeah.
great paper, really. I don't know. I was like super surprised stepping in, and then now I'm convinced it's super important. So that's great. But so I was actually asking before in the chat. It seems that there are several firms or groups that sell in many countries. Would be super interesting, kind of along the line also some of the work by Hannes to look whether the same firm prices in different ways in different countries. To kind of try to disentangle a little bit where these costs come from. And that is maybe this is data that you can collect. It's not going to be that many firms. I don't know, maybe even just calling them or I don't know, try to look in newspapers or everywhere wherever these prices show up. At least for me would be an interesting piece of evidence.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with your point. we've started looking, Tommaso, with your, and we've started looking at this by looking at the 10 largest firms that are operating globally, and we know which of our groups are part of that conglomerate. So far, we don't look at strategic pricing of these firms or even how they might use capacity in different countries. I think that's something we should do moving forward, as well as so the way we'd like to. So in our one shortcoming of the current version is that we're not able to estimate elasticities of substitution. So if we had more data on construction sector firms as well as cement firms, we'll be able to make some more progress there, as well as look at firm entry more directly. So do we see firms enter in certain markets, and how does that affect their pricing? So I think this is where within country data would be really helpful. Yes. Zach, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, Martina, I know you've looked at construction costs in different countries in other work, but I wonder if it'd be possible beyond the kind of price of cement to think about the price of something, a basic construction, like a building of a certain size, which is going back, I guess, to the old version of the ICP. What's the cost of building a bridge or a 5-story cement building? Not to push you in the direction of doing that, but as additional evidence that these differences in cement prices correspond to differences in the cost of constructed investment goods. I think that'd be really interesting to see, and since you presumably have it from the older data, or from, say, the World Banks. I'm thinking of institutions like the bank that pay for similar kinds of projects in many countries, and be interesting to know just how much less you can do with $1 million of aid in a number of different countries.
Yeah, and so the issue that the constraint here, and I mean, I've looked at this almost a decade now in terms of making progress on measuring the cost of construction and cost of constructed capital, which is why in the paper on roads that came out in 2016, we used road construction costs, because that's a measurable unit cost. The cost of a 4-lane highway is something we can compare across space, whereas buildings are just really tricky to get at. So you need to ex ante specify a bill of quantities. It'd be great to see if the ICP is willing to share these earlier data. It's done by the ICP's regional offices, I'm assuming. I could try see that. Unfortunately, a bank has decided to discontinue the roads cost database, which is a real pity, because it's such a nice database and it's a project that they have funded. So, and it's used so widely as well by policymakers who often don't know at all what the price is in the neighboring country, and then see that it's a fraction. And so I think it's something that, if anybody is talking to people who can make this happen, I think would be great, a great data to have. I think the other one that I can think of is what's the size of a classroom? They're building so many schools, there must be a way of backing out some average price of a classroom in a school. Yeah.
Let's have a last question from Luis before we go to the breakout rooms.
Hi, Martina. Thank you for the paper. Just quick question. So in your motivation, you mentioned a lot about public goods and also the part of buildings. And yet we only have here, due to data constraints, one price per country. So I was wondering if it's possible to have some notion of how much a country, say any country in Africa, is lagging behind in terms of infrastructure versus buildings. So you would understand a little bit about where this is driven by the government through licenses, or is it really your story about a lack of competition? Because the economics, if it's this only driven by public goods, might be a little bit different, no? It's more like a bidding process where one firm takes all, and then connected with John Kabowski's question, maybe you really need a certain scale to start operating, that it's only driven by once you start there with the government. But I'm probably asking too much due to data constraints. It's a very interesting paper.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point. We haven't thought about it in that way, but that's something we should think about more. Yeah. I mean, it ties in with the literature that looks at government construction and efficiency in the construction of public goods, or investment goods, with some of the earlier work by.
Yes, and especially since you're interested about the development stage, so you can make an assessment where you have an infrastructure deficit and how countries are current versus is really like a home building deficit and how countries are trying to keep it up with the pace.
Yeah, great, thanks.